So the Yasa Sutta, and I was just thinking, yes, this might relate a little bit to the question you brought up too about associations.
When you were like describing the sutta, I thought the same thing. That it kind of seems to like address that concern that I have.
Yeah, and so it's a common concern that was even prevalent during the Buddhist time, and that's what the sutta relates to. Let me read some of it. The short sutta, the Yasa Sutta, the short sutta teaches the wisdom, teaches that developing the wisdom of the Buddha will bring the ability to avoid self-aggrandizing and the distraction that occurs from creating a Dhamma practice that is dependent on external entanglements as its theme. So what does that mean? It's very easy, and I would say even very common in modern Buddhism, and this is true from right when I started joining different groups and following different lineages, in a very subtle way, almost imperceptible, meaning that it's hard for you even to recognize that you're doing it because everyone else around you is doing it, to create a specialness about the group that you have now joined. Whether it's a small local Sangha, don't think about this one. And I'll explain that in the efforts that I've made to avoid just what I'm talking about. Even if it's a small local Sangha or a worldwide organization that creates specialness over being a part of that organization, fine. We're free to join anything. We can join the Elks, we can join the local bowling club or the local knitting club or all the club. There's nothing wrong with it, except when we're interested in developing awakening as a Buddha taught awakening, and that group doesn't teach that. And now that you've identified with it, this is what the Buddha's talking about in the sutta, if I ever get to it. Once you've identified with that group, then whatever that group teaches and follows is what you will naturally follow. Again, there's nothing wrong with it, except if you're interested in actually awakening and if you're interested in actually developing what the Buddha taught. Now, I spent many, many years following other teachings through my identification with them, thinking that they were going to lead me to awakening. And I was not able to develop the path that they were trying to be nice about this. It didn't work for me. And it wasn't until I came to what the Buddha actually taught that any Buddhist practice had any real meaning to me and had any real effect. And so when I came across suttas like this, and there's quite a few in the Pali Canon, about the Buddha addressing that common problem of identifying with groups, which were really more just a social engagement than any type of real Dhamma practice, that I understand why I spent so many years getting more and more confused and frustrated, because I was identifying with something that wasn't what the Buddha taught. Again, doesn't make it wrong, but it would have been helpful for me if somebody said, you know, this is what we teach, and the Buddha taught something else, but they don't do that. And again, it was very common. As the Buddha's reputation grew and the amount of followers that he was gathering grew, a lot of the other spiritual teachers, there's a Brahmin system in the Buddhist time, claimed that they were teaching what the Buddha taught, simply because they wanted his followers. And there was always this kind of intrigue about people setting up scenarios trying to lure people away from the Buddha. And if you think about that, that's only about power and prestige, isn't it? It really doesn't have anything about teaching the truth. So I mentioned this Sangha. Almost every modern Buddhist practice that is hoping to establish itself as something separate, but also something part of Buddhism in general, will create a catchy name. And then you'll join that name. And there's a lot of interesting names, the Flying White Lotus Sangha of so-and-so. I don't want to mention any specific names, because then that is it sounds like I'm pointing at them as an example. Maybe I should, but I won't. The Buddha, as soon as he started teaching, established himself as someone who had something very important to teach. But he never gave it a name, except the Dhamma, meaning his truth. He never called his Sangha anything special. The only reference to the Buddha, even in the Pali Canon, is where he was. So often you'll hear me say the Buddha was at Savatthi, at Jita's Grove, Anathapindika's monastery. That just describes where he was, where he gave these teachings. There's nowhere. So even the name Cross River Meditation Center is used simply to define it as a place in Frenchtown. That's it. We're not followers of Cross River Meditation Center. At Cross River Meditation Center, we follow what the Buddha taught. Period. We follow the Dhamma. So again, excuse the long explanation of what I mean by that, by entanglements. And I'm going to go into it just a little bit more. Patient with a well-focused Sangha is very important in developing a useful Dhamma practice, but overindulgence and dependence on a group practice is counterproductive to developing the Dhamma. And what that means is that there has to be a balance between the support and the participation in the Sangha and our own solitary and secluded practice, which basically means we need to have a meditation practice that is not solely dependent on a Sangha, meaning that once a week we come and meditate with a group and that's enough. That's what this really is about. The solitary practice, taking refuge in a meditation practice, is as important, at least, as participation in the well-focused Sangha. So I'm betting that you two probably meditate together often. And so I'm bringing this up because there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying that you should always have separate meditation practices. What's important is that you avail yourself of that seclusion, separate from a meditation practice. But conversely, the Sangha is at least as important as that solitary practice. There's a balance there. The Eightfold Path is a middle way. While the Buddha always emphasized the importance of a well-focused Sangha, he also taught that Dhamma practice depends on and flourishes in seclusion. As in all things with the Buddhist teaching, the middle way is the guiding principle, meaning a nice balance between that. And really the important thing about this, and it's something that I've noticed a lot, especially when I was visiting different centers, but even from what I hear from other groups, there's people that make their Buddhist practice is basically going from one monastery to one meditation center to this other teacher to that one. And that's basically their practice. And on the surface, it appears like you're getting a well-rounded introduction. But unless those individual practices are well-focused on the Dhamma, you're just getting interpretive conceptual applications of what modern Buddhism is. And that itself leads to more distraction. So again, what's most important, what the Buddha is talking about here, is finding a well-focused Sangha, a Sangha that is well-focused on what he taught, if that's what you want to learn, and gain support from that Sangha, but also make sure you develop a meditation practice separate from anything else. Even during the Buddha's time, when you were a part of the Buddhist Sangha, you didn't spend 24/7 in idle chatter with everybody else around you. In fact, most of the time you were quiet because you didn't have anything useful to say. It wasn't not to say that there was enforced silence, but when meditation is described, it's always described that as individuals, they went off into the forest and found a quiet place to meditate. They very rarely meditated as a group, except when they did come together as a Sangha for a lesson, for a teaching from the Buddha or one of the senior monks. And then they would often meditate as a group. It wasn't a common practice. And you could say it was similar to what we do here, maybe a weekly practice. We get together and meditate as a group. The Yasa Sutta. Let's ask people if you have any questions. It looks like there's 4 people joining. So, and excuse me for getting away from this. If you have a question, please type it in. And I hope the chat window is available. I can't tell if it is, so well, we'll get to that later. The Yasa Sutta. The Buddha was teaching in Inkanagala. The locals all knew of the Buddha as a rightly self-awakened human being who was unexcelled as a teacher and whose teachings are entirely useful and practical. They were a close-knit group who depended on their group for direction and guidance rather than the Buddha's direct teachings. In other words, they knew of the Buddha's reputation, but they still were identifying with their own group and their own group's practices. They prepared a feast with many delicacies for the Buddha and his Sangha. They approached the Buddha's dwelling and began making a noisy racket. The Venerable Nagita was attending the Buddha. The Buddha asked Nagita, what was the racket all about? Nagita said, great teacher, those are the locals who have brought you many delicacies to honor you and the Sangha. Here's the brilliance of the Buddha. Nagita, I do not seek honor or recognition. Whoever cannot obtain through their own understanding with ease, as I do, the pleasure of renunciation, the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of peace, the pleasure of self-awakening, let them consent to this common pleasure, this dulling pleasure, this pleasure born of gain and of receiving offerings and fame. So what's the Buddha referring to and what's his objection? His objection is to create the impression that making a social engagement such as a grand dinner for the whole community and representing that as a Dhamma practice is hurtful and dulling, using the words of the Buddha. And he's not looking at, compare this to a lot of people seeking prestige and power. He's not interested in being honored as some godlike creature. He never held himself up that way. And he does not want the locals to see him in any way except as someone who has a useful teaching. Is that clear what the Buddha is referring to here? He's being very careful about not even giving the slightest impression that his Dhamma could be used in any way for self-aggrandizement. He sees that the locals are looking to create an identity with the Buddha for their own self-aggrandizement. Let's make a big party about this, rather than come to him in humbleness and ask him for his teaching. They have to make a social engagement out of it. Okay. Let me read my commentary here too. The Buddha has recognized that the locals have created a group identity through their association that overemphasized their association, that created a type of worship of the Buddha that dismissed important aspects of the Eightfold Path and allowed them to avoid seclusion. Again, hoping to join the Buddha rather than actually develop what he's teaching. And that's really very common in a lot of modern Buddhist groups and also just kind of New Age groups. You join the group, and it's by the association with the group that you'll gain some kind of merit. You'll gain some type of awakening. Nagita says to the Buddha, great teacher, please relent now. The locals will follow you because of your virtue and understanding. Again, Nagita, I do not seek honor or recognition. Whoever cannot obtain through their own understanding and with ease, as I do, the pleasure of renunciation, the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of peace, the pleasure of self-awakening, let them consent to this common pleasure, this dulling pleasure, this pleasure born of gain and of receiving offerings and fame. There are many who are unable to develop the understanding with ease that leads to the pleasure of renunciation, the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of peace, the pleasure of self-awakening. When people all live together, assemble together, and live committed to dwelling with a group, they are unable to develop understanding with ease, which is why they live together, assemble together, and live committed to dwelling with a group. Meaning their whole purpose for the group is not awakening. It's continuing to establish self-identities through a larger group identity. Is that clear? And that is a very important point that relates to what's occurring in Western Buddhism, and I'm using that in a loose term, and by extension, worldwide Buddhism. The common push is to find one unifying Buddhist principle that everybody can identify with, but excluding almost entirely the Buddhist teachings. In other words, they're developing one world Buddhist view and establishing that as a principle is more important than developing an understanding of Four Noble Truths. This is something the Buddha is addressing directly in this sutta. It was common during the Buddha's time, and it's maybe more prevalent now. And it's a very, very subtle but very powerful strategy to continue to ignore ignorance. Simply joining a group, whether it's a worldwide Buddhist organization or a local group that is not really focused on awakening, the joining in the group is now the substitution for actually developing a path to awakening. And that, again, that's what the Buddha is addressing here. And it's unfortunate what I found in a lot of modern Buddhism. I don't want to sound like I keep putting it down, but that's what this refers to. And it really was my experience. And again, when I came across these suttas, it helped explain how this all occurred and how I even became so confused and distracted by it. Nagita, when I see a community delighting in their interactions, laughing loudly, grabbing at one another, I know that they will not be able to develop the pleasure of renunciation, the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of peace, the pleasure of self-awakening, which is why they are delighting in their interactions and laughing loudly and grabbing at one another. Again, the Buddha is pointing out that their social interaction has become much more important than actually getting down and developing a Dhamma. Then there are those communities who revel in food, eating as much as they want, who take pleasure in sensory contact, pleasure in lying down, pleasure in dullness. I know that they will not be able to develop the pleasure of renunciation, the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of peace, the pleasure of self-awakening, have been eaten as much as they want, taking pleasure from sensory contact, from lying down in dullness. So again, the Buddha never made even the common ritual of needing to eat something that was shared intimately by a group on an ongoing basis. They had dinners, and there's suttas where they talk about what occurred at dinners, whether it was with locals or with maybe a king wanted to invite the Buddha over. But their common practice was not getting together and as a matter of course, something that they did over and over again when they got together. They didn't make a ritual of even having food. And again, there's organizations that they, on a regular basis, they incorporate eating meals together as part of their so-called Sangha practice. And they might, on a regular basis, they might watch movies or listen to tapes or listen to different presentations or have people read poems, and all that's wonderful. I'm not saying that the individual things there's something wrong with them, but to use it as your Sangha and your identification as a Sangha creates a distraction from getting down to the business of developing the Dhamma. So again, the Buddha is talking about maintaining your social activities separate from what you do as a Sangha. It's very important. And again, the opposite is more common. And in other words, the social model of getting together for dinner and making that as part of your evening Sangha is more common, or maybe often just refreshments. But again, when that's a common part of practice, when it's what you do every time you get together, you're creating a huge distraction from the Dhamma. You're making that much more important than actually getting down to the business of it. Is that clear? Is there any questions about that? It's really just a matter of keeping your Sangha and your Dhamma practice free from external entanglements. The Buddha continues, then there are those who attempt to develop concentration in a community where disturbance is likely, meaning all these other things going on. This, I know, is not conducive to developing the Dhamma. But those that have found the root of a tree or an empty hut, meaning a quiet place to meditate, the root of a tree or an empty hut, well secluded, even though they may be drowsy, they will dispel their drowsiness and be mindful of their seclusion. Then there are those that have established seclusion and are not well concentrated. Meditating in seclusion, they will quickly develop concentration and will protect and develop their concentration, meaning those in the beginning stages of meditation, as long as they continue in that practical framework, rather than being distracted by the group itself and the group activities, they will develop the Dhamma. And I've seen that so often. I mean, it's been quite a few years that I've been part of any type of group that wasn't well focused besides this one. But groups in the past, I've seen people that were eager to develop something that was useful would come and go. But they would never get to the point where they were offered a practice that would actually work. And it's so important, and it doesn't happen here. I mean, you see it. When people come here, they're told immediately, this is what we do here, and this is what we develop, and this is how we do it. And there's no offering of, let's come next week and we'll have dinner together first. It's not that. These folks will end their distracted mind and be mindful and appreciative of their seclusion. Then there are those that have established seclusion and are well concentrated. They will develop clinging release. They have found the benefit from their seclusion. Then there are those that cling to a group and takes food, clothes, shelter, and recognition from the group and becomes enamored with the group. They do not establish seclusion and will not end distraction. Nagita, then there are those well established in seclusion who receives food, clothes, shelter, and recognition from a group. Knowing the benefit of seclusion and restraint, no disturbance will arise in their mind. So notice the distinction there. If you're in those last two paragraphs, it's very subtle. The Buddha's pointing to creating an identity and a self and a sense of self-worth out of what the group may be giving you. As a teacher, maybe the group is giving you too much praise and too much material gain. But if you are well concentrated, meaning you are truly humble in the way you think and the way you act, no matter what people throw at you will have no effect, and you will be able to maintain a well-concentrated mind. It all depends on, as the Buddha is inferring here, it all depends on developing the Eightfold Path to maintain your well-concentrated and refined mindfulness. Not get thrown by your identity or what the group may be a part of. There's just a little, that's the end of that sutta, but it's just a line here that I wanted to mention in this context. This is from a sutta called the Bala Sutta, and the Buddha asked Sariputta, who was Sariputta at that point was one of the senior monks, of the importance of seclusion and the Eightfold Path to end the defilements of craving, aversion, and deluded thinking. Sariputta responds, the mind of a monk whose defilements are ended inclines towards seclusion. Their mind leans towards seclusion and tends towards seclusion. In other words, it's just a natural expression of a mind that is free of the defilements of greed, aversion, and deluded thinking. You tend towards seclusion. You tend to, it doesn't mean that you live an isolated life, but your mind itself draws you away from constant social entanglements and social engagements. You find time for seclusion. You find time to put down your cell phone and your tablet and your connection to Facebook and Twitter and all that. You find time to not be on the phone all the time. You find time to turn things off. And even when you're together, you find time to be quiet. Rather than the very common occurrence of constantly doing something, being engaged in something. And that's really the defining characteristic of someone who's developing the Dhamma, that they are inclined, like Sariputta is saying, they're inclined towards quiet, towards seclusion, towards not always being engaged in the outer world. That's a good way of benchmarking your own development. It doesn't mean that it's always easy to find, though, is it? That you can always disentangle yourself. It's hard. But at least if the desire is there, you know that your mind is inclining in the right direction, according to Sariputta and me. inclines towards seclusion, leans towards seclusion, tends towards seclusion, and stays in seclusion. They delight in renunciation, meaning, and we hear this all the time, how people, and you've all mentioned this, you're recognizing the things that are keeping you entangled in the world, continued eye-making. And it feels good when you recognize them and let them go, doesn't it? That's the delighting in renunciation. Entirely rid of the qualities that act as a basis for the defilements. And again, the defilements are greed, aversion, and deluded thinking. Entirely rid of the qualities that act as a basis for the defilements is also the strength of a Dhamma practitioner whose defilements are ending. Meaning you're aware of it, you're mindful of this process. It's working. You're waking up, you're gaining full human maturity. Sariputta continues, the Noble Eightfold Path is well developed by one whose defilements are ending. The fact that the Noble Eightfold Path is well developed by a Dhamma practitioner the fact is that the Noble Eightfold Path is developed by a Dhamma practitioner whose defilements are ending. With reference to which he affirms the ending of the defilements thusly, meaning they're mindful of it. The defilements are ended in me. You know it. You're aware of it. In the Viveka Sutta, and I'll conclude this with this. A monk sitting in seclusion considers the importance of withdrawing from worldly entanglements. Desiring seclusion, I have entered the forest, and yet my mind goes running outside. If I subdue my desire for people, then I will be happy and free from passion. That last line is the Viveka is just describing how when he first goes into the forest and enters seclusion, his mind goes running outside because of his desire for or his attachment to other people. But then he's also inferring that as his mind quiets down, that clinging attachment simply comes to an end. So that's the end of the talk. I'd like to hear what you have to say about it.
Yes. Up until you read the parts that Sariputta was saying, it seemed like when the Buddha was talking to one of the members of his Sangha, I forget his name, it seemed like when he was saying seclusion, it seemed like what he meant by seclusion was your like personal Dhamma practice. It just seemed like every time he said it, I almost I felt like he was saying, meditating at home and practicing the Dhamma practice on your own. And so to that sutta, which is aptly timed in my life, really kind of, that's sort of what I got from it, as well as the obvious point of the sutta, which is avoiding turning the Sangha into like a social group or anything other than a group of people practicing the Buddha's teachings.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly what he's pointing to. The importance of establishing a good portion, an important portion of your Dhamma practice in seclusion, meaning meditation. And also then the other, the broader aspect of that is as a Sangha, that Sangha should be representative of a well-focused mind rather than getting into a lot of different social things or social activities, such as, a common occurrence of meals or movies or, whatever else you might want to do. Keep it focused on the Dhamma.
And another thing about that, when you were first going over it, I kind of thought, well, that's really strict, like what the Buddha was saying. And I'm not trying to be a heretic or be rude, but it did seem a little harsh when he was saying that when he was describing the people that he said he knew couldn't learn the Dhamma. I thought that was kind of harsh, but the point he was making about really keeping it separate, I I think is like a good lesson, because I can see where just like a harmless, like, oh, let's, grab a slice of pizza, or let's all go down here before meditation. Like, it seems like, you're just going somewhere that isn't the group, but it totally changes your relationship to coming to the Sangha.
Yes. Wow. Thank you for that. The extraneous activities become more important and become the distraction. Well, you said it better than I did, but I'll continue. Than actually developing the Dhamma and supporting each other in that. And there's an, I'm not sure the right word. There's an inference of responsibility here too, that as a Sangha, and this is where the Eightfold Path comes in: right speech, right action, right livelihood. As a Sangha, it's my responsibility to support you in not becoming distracted by anything I might bring to the group, such as, let's get together for dinner every time or let's make dinner. Let's all have a potluck before our meditation class. Sounds like a nice idea, doesn't it? But if we did that all the time, then it would be very easy for the potluck and what we're bringing to be more important than actually getting down and having a class on the Dhamma, or something else, having a poetry reading, or anything. It could be anything. And that's such an important point. So it's not to say that they're wrong, and it's not to say we shouldn't do those things. But what you said was to understand the importance of keeping a focus on what the Dhamma is and not letting it get lost in distraction through other things. So even the monks and nuns and the Buddha himself, they weren't isolated from the world. Every day they got up off their cushion and walked into town to get a bowl of food. And they interacted with the locals. They taught them the Dhamma. And then they came back and they went through their days and took care of their grounds and studied and listened. But they weren't isolated. But they were secluded in a sense that when it was time to meditate, that's how they did it. And when they came together, one of the rules of the Sangha, one of the first rules of the Sangha was, when you come together as a Sangha, you discuss the Dhamma and nothing else. And of course, the reason why that is the Buddha didn't want his monks and nuns getting lost in idle chatter and talking about the politics of the day or who won the chariot race or any of that. And when you come together as a Sangha, you talk about the Dhamma. It doesn't mean that the monks and nuns of the Buddha Sangha never talked about anything else. But like we do on retreat, most of our conversations are well focused and at least framed by the Eightfold Path in some way. So important. So thank you for that insight too. Do you have anything else you'd like to say about tonight's class or your practice?
Yeah, one other thing that just like the word seclusion kind of made me think of tonight is not anything specifically about this sutta, but in the suttas, you really need to understand that the context for literally every word that's said is like within the Eightfold Path and not, or just like the Dhamma. And so a word, like when I heard seclusion, like all the connotations of the word, come to my mind. And it really makes listening to the suttas a lot more peaceful when you can realize that all the words are just simply referring to the teachings of the Buddha, and not like it doesn't, like every time he said seclusion, he doesn't mean to like isolate yourself, which is kind of like what I think of first when someone says seclusion. But
yeah,
through the sutta, it kind of helped me like realize that some words, and just another example that's easier is ignorance. Like when ignorance is brought up in the suttas, it's a very specific kind of ignorance.
Yeah.
But when you say ignorance, outside of this, it means a totally huge, broad thing.
Yeah.
And like most words that come up in suttas.
Again, Nas, thank you for that insight. It's so important to understand the context that the Buddha taught. And that really gets back to, I got an email from Tracy today, from Salt Lake City. And she just mentioned again how important it is to understand dependent origination. And it really is important to understand dependent origination, that the Buddha awakened to that and taught the Four Noble Truths, including the Eightfold Path, and that everything he taught was in that context. So again, when the Buddha talked about ignorance, the first line in dependent origination, it's from ignorance that leads to all manner of suffering. The Buddha's not saying that we're just ignorant people. It's a very specific ignorance. It's ignorance of Four Noble Truths. And of course, like anything else, until you study something, you're ignorant of it. You're ignorant of how to drive a car until somebody teaches you, or to ride a bike, or use a fork. So the fact that we don't know something yet until we've studied it and developed it should not be taken personal, even though it is at times. It's an aspect of a mind rooted in ignorance to take things personal, isn't it? But when we understand that the context of everything the Buddha taught, including words like seclusion or ignorance, are taught in this overall context of developing understanding, profound understanding of Four Noble Truths. That's it. And that helps keep us focused too. Thank you. Isabella, good to see you tonight. Any questions, comments, or?
How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for asking.
I am aware of things that even when I'm doing like I'm becoming aware of things that I am taking personally within the teachings, but at the same, I'm able to like let go of it. Yeah, but I think like my process right now, my development is really seeing, I guess, like the flames like of like my existence in it. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I do see like how the way I would react to something or these things, whether it's here or at work or it's like the school or anything, like how the suffering that it does cause me, and just being able to be aware of that. And it's happening a lot not faster, but it's, I'm not going, the train isn't like 35 cars long now, like kind of thing. It's happening. Oh yeah, it is happening faster, and I'm able to really come back to my breath. And yeah, so, and I kind of even realized that like today, like recently, the past few days, that that's like what's been happening, because it takes me some time, a few days to like, especially with with Tuesdays teaching, that was a big one for me. I mean, they all are like very. It's just developing this has been, but in a good way. Like I'm just very grateful again. I feel like this every class, to just have to be able to be developing this and having the teachings and having the Sangha and having, it's very grateful.
Yeah, thank you. And Isabel, what you're describing is understanding I'm making. Understand, you're gaining insight into the whole thing. Into the impermanent nature of all things, the not self-characteristic, and how that characteristic makes things personal. And when we recognize and start depersonalizing our life, we're diminishing those wrong views. This is exactly how it should develop. Good for you, and thank you for sharing that with the group. Kevin, good to see you tonight. How are you, my friend?
Wow. So, I think it is important. I think, it just points out the need to avoid those distractions. There's so many distractions. Even when we do sit in seclusion, when I do meditate, my mind does run outside. It's immediate. It's every time, time is dead. And then before I realize it, I'm thinking about all kinds of stuff. And it's that constant need to really bring it back to the breathing again and again. So if you had a group where you had more and more distraction, I can see how you would just go farther and farther afield. You just get immersed in the social aspect and you lose the Dhamma.
Yeah.
Interesting, I'm reading a book by Jack Kerouac. You probably know it. It's the Dharma Buns.
Yeah.
And it was written, 60 years ago. And he was very interested in, he was a Buddhist, or he was interested in Buddhism. I don't know. But the book, there's one guy, and it's a novel.
Yeah.
And the one guy is, keeps in seclusion. He sleeps outdoors by himself. But at the same time, it's kind of a party group all the time. They're always having meals and they're always drinking. They're always thinking about relationships and their, even sexual relationships and things like that. And knowing the Dhamma, you realize the distraction that they were having. I thought when I started to read it would be, sort of
A supplement.
helping me underline my practice, but in a way it does, because you can see, well, that's not what the practice is. Yeah. And it's okay to read it. It's interesting that somebody really famous really thought about it. And there are quotations from the Buddha in the book, sprinkled through.
Yeah.
The teaching of the Dhamma is in there. So, and then it has to do with this teaching that you gave tonight, that we don't want to just have this party and praise the Buddha. That's not how we're going to get
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up, Kevin. It's a great book. I think I'm going to read it again. And when you can see it from the framework of the Eightfold Path, you see the foolishness of some of the practices there.
Yeah.
And the word that's used in the sutta, the self-aggrandizing that comes from being this modern Buddhist practitioner. And then you add all these other things, the promiscuity and and in the book, I remember I read it a long time ago, but as I remember it, all that the life they were living now became their Buddhist practice, when a lot of that stuff had nothing. In fact, it was contradictory to developing awakening. But because they had identified now as a Buddhist, this was all now part of their Buddhism, the promiscuity and the drugs and all that. And that's still, I see that a lot today in modern Buddhist groups. Just the almost an arrogance about what they're doing, rather than when you read what the Buddha taught and how he taught and how he lived his life, there was none of that, because there couldn't be. This is what we do. The essence of a mind ignorant of Four Noble Truths is an overblown ego, continuing to establish an ego self. So an awakening human being is diminishing that. And so, what Sariputta was talking about, you're inclined towards seclusion. A self-referential ego self, you think about it, is always wanting to put itself out there and make sure people are knowing it and seeing it. You can't stand not being noticed, can you? As that diminishes, you're not so interested in establishing yourself in any way through associations at all. You find the root of a tree or an empty hut, and like-minded folks that are like you. You associate with people that are focused on the Dhamma. That's what a well-focused Sangha is about. And I don't mean for this to sound self-aggrandizing. When I first started the center, I can't remember, I think it was 8 years ago. For at least the first couple of years, there were always people coming in and out that wanted to introduce other teachings and introduce other practices and do this and do that, even during class. And I always resisted it because, and maybe a little bit of selfishness, I wanted one place in the world where the only thing that we focused on was what the Buddha taught. And when I say that we're so fortunate what has developed here, I mean it. It's very unique what has developed in Frenchtown. And we were able to do this 3 times a week, which is really remarkable. That we have people that are interested in just what the Buddha taught. And we're going to keep doing it, I think. Any other questions or comments? I can't. The problem with the chat, I can't see. No questions. I noticed that there's 2 folks still here. There were 4. And I don't know if this chat window is working, but if one or both of you could just say hello so I know that it's working. And if you don't, I'll assume it's not. Well, thank you for joining anyway. There was an announcement. I can't think of it. Well,
is the painting
party,
is that scheduled?
It's not. Thank you for. I'm gonna no. I gotta get. We've been bouncing around a few dates. We had it scheduled. It was actually scheduled for this Sunday, but I had to change it because I'm teaching a group of kids from the Unitarian Church this Sunday here. So but it's gonna be sometime in January, I think, on a Sunday. So but as soon as we come up with a date, I'll announce it. All right, find your relaxed meditative posture. We'll finish with metta. And gently close your eyes and gently close your mouths. And holding your back straight but not stiff. Your ears aligned with your shoulders and nose aligned with your navel. And again, letting go of any thoughts that might be distracting to the past or to the future, or that may have arisen from our talk tonight. And these are the Buddha's words on metta from the Karaniya Metta Sutta. This is what should be done by one who is skilled in goodness and who knows the path of peace. Let them be able and upright, straightforward and gentle in speech, humble and not conceited, contented and easily satisfied, unburdened with duties and frugal in their ways, peaceful and calm and wise and skillful, not proud or demanding in nature. Let them not do the slightest thing that the wise would later reprove. Wishing, in gladness and in safety, may all beings be at ease. Whatever living beings there may be, whether they are weak or strong, omitting none, the great or the mighty, medium, short, or small, the seen and the unseen, those living near and far away, those born and to be born, may all beings be at ease. Let none deceive another or despise any being in any state. Let none through anger or ill will wish harm upon another. Even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings. Radiating kindness over the entire world, spreading upwards to the skies and downwards to the depths, outwards and unbounded, freed from hatred and ill will. Whether standing or walking, seated or lying down, free from drowsiness, one should sustain this recollection. This is said to be the sublime abiding. By not holding to fixed views, the pure-hearted one, having clarity of vision, being freed from all sense desires, is not born again into this world. Thank you all for a wonderful class. Peace.